Greetings, brothers and sisters. So this is one of two voiceovers I'm doing this morning that I think are really important, at least, for me. Right? I had this really good meditation, and I think these things are profound and things I haven't talked about, at least in this way. I have a voiceover to do for my 137th Journey series, and I'll put this voiceover in that as well. But this will go on a video. And it's about the pro-life movement, the anti-abortion movement. And so I get comments all the time. I mean, like every day there'll be 50 comments like this or more, depending on the day and the video, where somebody will comment from the point of view. You know, when you read a book in school and they're asking you to say, what's the point of view of the writer? Is it first person? Is it, what these various types of, here I have a list of them. First person, second person, third person, omniscient, which narrative perspective is best, mixed narration, point of view, fourth person, these things, right? And so what I'm talking about is when a person has the point of view where they are thinking they're having a conversation with me. So I say something in the video, and then they respond to that, what I've just said, without repeating what I said, right? Without saying what I said in the video. And this could be from a video from 2 months ago or 5 years ago. And they're responding like we're sitting at a table together. We're on the phone or whatever it might be, or even chatting back and forth or something, texting. And they're responding to something I said, and I'm aware of what I just said, right? But it's a video that's an hour long, and they're writing a sentence in reaction to something I said, and I have no idea what it is that I said. Like they think I remember everything that I said, and based on their comment, I'll be able to figure out what they're responding to. These are really bad comments. They're people who are not reality-based in the dynamics of the situation, because I talk about things and then I forget about them, and even a video from that day, and so I don't know what they're talking about, right? They would have to repeat what I said that they're triggered by, or is praising even, if somebody's praising something, because I have no idea. Like even hours after I've released the video. And so they're thinking that we're in some sort of dialogue together, and we're not, right? And I don't care about my own beliefs on many subjects because they don't have an effect. I don't have any effect on other than saying things on the internet. But our beliefs are, certainly we're manifesting things with our beliefs, and we're, connected to God, whatever it is. So our beliefs are, in that way important. But a lot of things are just going to go a certain way, whether we believe or are against them or not. The majority of people might be against something. It isn't going to stop that thing from happening, right? Just because we are against it. Our beliefs aren't enough to prevent something wrong from happening, and we've seen it over and over again. People are very, are very connected, or they are very defined by their beliefs, and I'm not one of those people, right? Because beliefs and opinions are meaningless at this point in terms of how they're going to affect what's going to happen next in the collective story. Your beliefs affect your perception of reality and what you're going to manifest in your life. And your distorted beliefs are going to cause you pain and suffering or whatever it is. But that's not my problem, right? And so most of these things I say I don't really care that much about, because they're not something that I'm going to affect one way or another. They're just my opinions about something that's happened in the news or whatever it might be. And I said, abortion is murder because life begins at conception. Like that's, it's not just my belief, but it's based in spiritual and scientific fact, right? But in terms of abortion as a construct in our societies, without it, our societies would collapse. I said these things. And I got a few comments on that, and I remembered this. Like, this is one of the rare times I remembered kind of what I said and what people were reacting to. One of the comments was this one, which I went back and found here. And the person writes, here it is. I gotta find it. And the person writes, that's not it. Here I found it. The person writes, Paul, there are 6 million abortions a year in China. Thoughts? Well, I don't even understand the context of the question. I assume it was about what I was saying about, all these things. What do you mean? Like that's too many, or it doesn't put a dent in their population, or, whatever it is. But the problem I have with pro-life people is they're not really pro-life. The pro-life movement, because, well, let's start here. And before you react, you should hear what I have to say, because you haven't heard it before. And so if you're a pro-lifer, you should probably think about what I'm saying here before you say something stupid, which is the tendency in the internet. But even people who are going to react will probably put this in the title and, whatever. Just like the pro-choice people aren't pro-choice, right? They weren't pro-choice when it came to the bloop. It's the same kind of thing, which I'm going to talk about here. And it's just true. You might not like it, but it's true. And so let's start here. There is about half the world's population or more that doesn't have a place in society. This is the people that the controllers, the so-called elite or whatever you want to call them, refers to as useless eaters. People that don't have anything to contribute to society. There's no job for them. There's no place for them. And we're talking about 4 billion people or more. These are people who live on less than $2 a day, or $1 a day, 1/3 of the population. And so I would say over half the population, and again, we're talking about billions of people, they have no way to contribute to society, no way to contribute to the economy. There's no job for them. There's no place for them. There's a stupid theory out there that everybody in the world can fit into the state of Texas with each person having an acre of land. And so that overpopulation is a hoax. But those people are just completely ignorant of all of these facts. That there's no place for most of the people, or at least half of the people in this world, have nothing to contribute. They have nothing that they have to offer the society because of the circumstances of their birth. And most of the kids that are aborted come from that, part of the society. So most of the abortions that happen are kids who are going to be born into poverty and are never going to get out. Like there'd be a rare exception, right? One of the arguments against abortion is that a higher developed soul might be born, some great soul might be born into this type of poverty. And there's been people who have been born into poverty who have become world figures or scientists or in some case saints, right? There's been people born into poverty. What about like Mother Mary, who was an impoverished young woman who was, in her teen years, who was impregnated. The legend goes by God, and it wasn't and I don't believe this to be true, was an immaculate conception. I believe that's just something made up, but she was a single mom, impoverished, and gives birth in a manger, right? So she was somebody who, if abortion was available, maybe she would have had it, right? And so Jesus wouldn't have been born. So that's the argument there. And I understand that to be a legitimate argument. But in most cases, a higher developed soul is going to choose, your soul chooses the place and family and circumstances of your birth. And so a higher developed soul is going to choose a situation where it's not going to be aborted, right? But whatever it is, that is what that's not really the main point here. The main point is that the majority of these people have very little chance in life. Their circumstances and their destiny is already shaped by the poverty in which they're born into, the caste which they're born into in India, or the social, whatever their race is. Like, let's say they're in a country that there's ethnic cleansing, like the Palestinian people, for example, being born in a country where you are the lesser of a population, and your circumstance of your birth is you're limited to what you can achieve economically and spiritually in all these other ways. People were born in poverty in these countries in China and Africa and in India and these places, but even the people in America. Now there are neighborhoods, let's say you live in a suburb or you live in the nice part of the city, in, one of these big cities. You live where rich people live, upper middle class, right? And rich people in terms of the world, right? If you make more than $20,000 a year, it's even less than that. The average global income is about $12,000 a year. So you think about that, right? If you're above that, and know how, again, it's more difficult in America because things are more expensive, in Europe and America and some of these places. But whatever your income, you're still making a lot more money than the average person in the globe. But that's not enough to live on, right? And, America or these other richer countries. But still, you get the point here. But the majority of people are born into lives where they have no opportunity for advancement. America is one of the better places because an impoverished person can work really hard and become a billionaire, which is crazy, but it's true. Certainly a millionaire. And, have some luck and things like this, but through their own personal efforts. But the majority of people just don't have that in them. They don't have that drive, don't have that ability. The majority of people born into these circumstances. So I work with kids in treatment centers like this, right? There was a kid that came into, I worked, the first treatment center I worked in was for what was called sexually reactive kids. They were kids who were sexually abused, and then they went on to act out some way, and they were younger kids. They were ages 10 to 14. But this was a 7-year-old kid who was in a smaller, younger kids unit. There were kids who were from 5 to 10, and that was, problematic because some of the older kids would take advantage of the younger kids because they were all, sexually, or, whatever happened to them had made them become sexual beings when they were way too young to their innocence had been violated, right? And so they put this kid in with older kids because he was so acting out with the younger kids, right? But he's only 7 years old. And I read his file. We had to read their files. And his parents had trained him and his brother to perform, these inappropriate acts on other adults for money, right? So these parents were pimping out their kids. And his little brother showed up one day, and his little brother was dressed up in a little suit, and he had glasses on. He looked like, some cute little 3-4-year-old kid. Maybe he was 5, but he was small for his age. Whatever it was. His brother was 7. And his social worker, the kid's social worker, came in and was bringing this kid over to meet her brother. And I said, "What's wrong with him?" And she goes, "He has AIDS and he's dying. Not HIV, but AIDS." And he was saying goodbye to his older brother. So this cute little kid that came into our treatment center was dying of AIDS because his parents had pimped him out and he had no life, right? And it made me feel like just like dying. Like, like I wasn't suicidal, but it was like so painful. I mean, I just was, stunned by this reality of this kid's life and this, people living like this. And I'd seen a lot of things. I mean, things that were, either you read it in the kid's intake file, the kid would talk about their life or whatever it is. And of course, I went on to get my master's in counseling and work with teenage sex offenders in a treatment center. And I saw the dregs of society. But I also worked as an outpatient, an outpatient clinic where their parents would bring these kids in to get medicated. And the kids would sometimes have individual therapy sessions. They're supposed to have one, the way that was framed is they were supposed to come in and get individual therapy every week. And then they would see a psychiatrist once a month and get on ADHD medication. The parents were very eager to put their kids on medication because the kids were hyper because they were growing up eating, Fruit Loops and sugar, and they were around they were just impoverished kids eating bad food and in difficult environments. And there are these places where if you live in a nice part of the city or if you live in the suburbs, there are places you don't go. There's places you don't travel through unless you have to. Maybe you can see them from the highway, maybe you quickly drive through them. But there are neighborhoods where you kind of go into a daze and don't really think about the people living there. When I was, my family and I were traveling back from India, we were stuck, there's a whole problem with we missed a flight in England and had to stay there. And it was so expensive. And, it was just one of those things. We were there. I brought my kids to see a castle, even though we didn't have much money, and we were kind of in desperate states coming back to America. I had $5,000 to restart my family's life based in nothing. I had 4 kids and, this YouTube channel. And I didn't have a car. I didn't have, it was just a bad situation. But we were there in England. I'm like, we may never go back. And we were driving through, and we were on these different trains and things. And there's all these projects. There's projects everywhere in London. Impoverished people. It's the economic capital of the world, but there's poor people everywhere. And of course, in India, the poverty there is, it's soul crushing. I don't know if your soul can't be crushed, so that's not really good. But it's just so depressing. And there'd be times when I was in India, there are cities I was in of 26 million people in the greater area, 16 million people. And when you would drive through the cities, there'd be times you'd be stuck. They don't have proper traffic lights and, all these things, right? And you'd be stuck in impoverished areas and just the crush of humanity there. Like a trip that should take 45 minutes would take 8 hours. And I drove, in the back of some car, not drove, but was in a taxi, just sitting in traffic for 8 hours going from one side of the city to the other. And you would see things and people living. There's people who are in these countries that they don't get enough protein. They're often, their height is, they're 5 feet tall. They're not like people that you see, like tall American people, right? They're, 4 feet, 5 feet tall. 5'2", maybe, whatever. And they don't, have the capacity because of lack of protein. Their brains don't develop, or lack of nutrition, in their diet. Their brains don't develop, and they're not around people with abstract thought. And their families, and they live in these huts. Their huts are maybe like 8 foot by 8 foot, and there's a family living in there, right? And I've seen more people taking a dump on the street. In India, it's countless people. You're driving through there, and someone's just sitting there, taking a dump. You're driving through. I was on trains going through the rural part. And the countryside in India is beautiful, and there's an ancient spiritual condition there. There was a time where India was America, but also spiritual. Like it had, India was the sort of the centerpiece of the the economy, the world economy, and it was like America is, but also with spirituality and all these saints. There's been all these saints that have been through India, and there's a nice spiritual condition there, ancient condition, and it's hard to describe. But the poverty now and the crush of humanity, there's like 1.3 billion people living there, and half of them or more there's no job for, right? There's no future for them. And even the ones who grow up in more educated families, these are people, if you live there and you have money, you can get servants. And when I was in India, and my ex went back to America, just sort of abandoned the family, which was, ultimately a good thing. But I was there with my 4 kids. And my kids had grown up on a farm, and they did chores and, all these things. But I hesitated, but people are like, you can get this, we can help you get a maid. I was like, well, I don't want a maid. It felt weird to me, right? But this woman came in. She was a younger woman, and she cleaned the house and cooked a meal every day. And I paid her $70 a month. She was there 6 days a week. Nice lady, right? Didn't speak much English, but she is cheery. I ended up leaving her when we left India. I left her our washing machine and like things that, she could never afford, because I had to either give it to the landlords. We'd bought a washing machine and furniture and things like this there. And I didn't want my landlord who was, so I just gave it to this woman, right? But she, she did all this work for $70 a month, right? Like, it's crazy amount of work that she did. And these maids, and she was overcharging me because I was from America. Like, she'd probably get $50 or $40 from, richer Indian people. Some of these Indian people would have 10, 15 servants there because, and they're living, these people go home, they come to these nice houses, but they go home and live in huts, right? they were building a building, like they're putting up like a condos and things, and or apartments, and there were people who were living on the site where they're building, whole families. They would sleep in this building that wasn't constructed, it was just girders and things. They would carry things on their heads, and they'd work 12 hours, and then they'd just sleep there at the work site, and then they'd move to a new work site, right? And they were living there, no shelter, no whatever it was. I mean, you just see this. These were people working. Then there's people who, are beggars. And the third master of the Sajmark system, when he was alive, back when I started in 1993, I went to India in 1990, the end of 94, 95. And he he had said, don't give money to beggars. And it's very hard as a Western person, you're targeted. And, a rupee, the currency in rupee that's like the dollar in India, it was at the time it would take 45 rupees to equal $1. Later on, I think it's at 60 or something like this, the currency exchange rate. And so, if you give someone 100 rupees, it's like $2. You give them 50 rupees or 10 rupees, and that's a lot of money to these beggars. There's some of these kids, and you'd go to a train station, and these kids would come up to you, and they were dirty, they were filthy, they were dirty hands, and they come up and they grab your clothing and say, please, sir. They couldn't speak English, but they would, targeted white people and things like this. And they would surround you, tugging on your clothes, and if you gave them money, it would even get worse, right? And so, I felt bad about not giving them money, right? Because these were just, the poverty there. And especially when you went to a place like a train station where you were seeing the poverty firsthand. But the first time I rode a train, I was sitting like on the aisle. You had these sleeper seats. And we stopped at a place, and these beggars started to come through. And one kid had like a maimed arm, and it was broken when he was born. So someone would break his arm so he would be able to beg when he was a baby. Like, that's how sick this is, right? And he would stick his broken arm in your face, and they wouldn't leave until you gave them money. Like, they would just sit there, and you wouldn't want to make eye contact or whatever, right? They were just like, and there was a procession of these beggars coming through. And the last one, his legs were completely effed up, and the person was just sliding along the floor. And these were young kids, right? And I looked up, and there was a guy who was like a beggar pimp who was bringing these kids on and sending them down the aisle. Like, he was in charge of these kids, and there was about, 6 or 7 of them. And they went through the aisle begging for money. And I realized what Master Charji was saying, that you were supporting an abusive, human trafficking type of situation, much like prostitution, but even worse, where these kids were being maimed and were being, farmed out. And any money you gave them, they was going to the beggar pimp, right? And they were just being, used in the most, the despicable way. And so by supporting begging, it was supporting an industry in India that's horrible. But the issue here is that most people in India, at least half of them, then we're talking about 500 million people or more, have no place. They have no jobs for them. There's nothing in society. But even the ones who grow up in more suburban type of situation, there's limited amount of jobs. Let's say in India, there's 500 million quality jobs. And working at a fast food restaurant is a quality job. Sweeping, there's these women who would sweep. They would have these basically grass brooms, and they would squat down on the ground and just sweep. They're used to squatting because they don't have toilets and things like this, right? And so they, their leg muscles, they're okay. They just they're close to the ground, they squat, and then they do this frog walk, and they wipe off the sidewalks. They sweep the sidewalks with these grass brooms, right? And so, those are jobs I'm talking about. They're jobs people are actually getting money for. And then there's just all these people that don't make any money at all. And then there are the good jobs, the jobs where people can live, with electricity, and they can live with air conditioning, and they can live, lives where they're not in just complete poverty, and they can eat relatively well. Like food's a big thing, right? And there's not enough of those jobs. And so when you're in school in India, these kids that are in school in India, if they fail a test, you could be in third grade, fifth grade, eighth grade, depending on whatever it is. You fail a test and your life is ruined. Like your only option is to get out of your circumstances or at least to avoid disaster. So your parents have a little bit of money, right? And you're growing up, maybe you have a few servants and you live in a place, you have air conditioning and you have a house or a nice apartment or something. And there's so much pressure on you educationally that if you fail, you'll be in the dregs of society. You'll never get a job, and there's no welfare state and things like this. I mean, they do have, giveaways by politicians, but there's no social services like we have here. That you're going to be living in a hut, or even worse, right? Your life is ruined. You can't get a job, like you can't get a quality job. When you are getting customer service from Microsoft or Apple or any number of tech companies, and you're talking to a foreign person, that's a great job in that country. If you're talking to someone in India or Philippines or wherever it is, that's a prize job, like a job that you wouldn't even think of having, doing basically sort of telemarketing type stuff where people are calling up and you're helping them with your computer. That is a great job for these people, right? These people are, they're fighting to get those type of jobs. And some of those people are like top in their class educationally, right? A lot. I mean, they're all doing well academically, and that's the kind of job I'm talking about. Even like so, these young people who have this pressure on them academically, and so there's suicides when they fail tests. The stress level for the kids is where they're suicidal. My kids were hanging out. There's a Lology Memorial Omega School. Lology was the first master of the Sage-Mark system, and the third master built a school and named it after him. And this school had people from all castes. There were people who couldn't afford the school, but then they had people from America and Europe who went to this school, and it was good academically. And these were kids who, had loving parents and these kind of things. But there was like a 10-year-old kid, and he felt so much pressure from the test. He got on a train, and he disappeared for like 3 months. Like no one could find him because he didn't want to take the test. He was so stressed out by it, right? So this is the kind of academic pressure and economic pressure these kids grow up, right? I had a friend when I was in high school, and he was like an exchange student from Korea. And I was asking him, like different, whatever the question was, the answer was because Americans' kids don't do math, right? Like, because there's all these people from foreign countries, the brain drain. I see this a lot from the people who do Sage-Mark or do Heartfulness in America, Indians, who would come to this country and they would do jobs that were good jobs, high-paying jobs. They were academically successful people and trained people from India. And they would come to America and make a lot of money because American kids don't want to do math, right? American kids are entitled. Like the schools that we have, as much as we complain about the schools and all these things, right? How much we hate going to school, what kids say, whatever it is, right? But the schools in India, like I talked to a principal and this woman who was running the school, and she said most of the schools in India teach the kids to the test. And so they get the tests, these placement tests that are given throughout the country, right, or whatever, throughout the state. These are government-sanctioned tests. Like you have testing now in schools. And, kids who grow up in suburban areas in America, these types of things have a better chance because those tests, they're prepared for those tests by being around people who talk like, the people who write the tests and the people who make up the tests and that kind of education. People from the inner city, people from, different rural areas and things, impoverished areas. They're not prepared or don't understand these questions in the education the way it's presented because they're not around people like that, right? Same thing in India, these places, but even worse. And so they would teach the kids, they would get the kids to memorize the question. That's what they would do first. And they'd have to memorize all the questions. Let's say there was 100 questions on the test. They'd have to memorize every question. And then they would get the kids to memorize the answers. And they would do this over a period of months. And the kids who were better at memorizing would do better. And the kids who weren't would fail, and they would be put in a position where they were never going to get a good job. And I'm not talking about a good job, what you would think is a good job, but what they would think is a good job, right? And so that's the kind of pressure these people live in, and the kind of circumstances where there's just not enough jobs. There's not enough quality jobs. And there's, half the population that doesn't have any job. It doesn't have anything that you would regard as income or a contribution to society. So that's what I'm talking about when we're talking about overpopulation, right? There are people who there's no place for them. There's nothing they can contribute. They have nothing to offer based in the circumstances of their birth. And you can say, well, there are people who are like untouchable in India, people in poverty in America, homeless people who grew up in homeless situation who become millionaires or become very successful. Yeah, that's true. But it's only one slot, right? There's only, 10 people out of a million who can become successful or whatever it is, right? There's only so many available slots for people like that, right? There's only so many people who can become, not everyone can become a billionaire, certainly. Not everyone can become a millionaire, right? There's just so many available slots. And so I want to go back to my story now when I was working at this outpatient clinic. And so I know of one sort of success story. So the best client I ever had, the best, whatever it was, patient, whatever you want to say, was a kid who was in 8th grade. He was biracial. His dad was, he said Scottish, but he never met his dad. Like one time his mom, they were somewhere and his mom said, "Hey, that's your dad over there," and pointed him out. His dad was a drug addict, a white guy who was a drug addict. His mom was a black woman who was also a drug addict. She was on crack. And he wanted to get out of his circumstances. So he found out about this outpatient clinic where I worked. And he, this is an 8th grade kid. So think about this. I mean, I couldn't have done this when I was in 8th grade. Like I was, of course, it wasn't in this circumstance, but this kid found out about a clinic because he wanted to get help, like therapy, to have an adult in his life to advise him on his, a pathway to get out of his impoverished circumstances. And so he took 2 buses and, made an appointment all on his own, right? Did all these things, things that I probably wasn't capable till I was like late in my 20s. And, even then, right? He sought help. He was seeking some kind of, what was available in this outpatient clinic and, me, so it wasn't like some great, whatever it was, right? And he took 2 buses and he made, arrangements, and he came to every appointment. And, we would talk about his life, and he would come home, he would go home and he'd open the refrigerator, there'd be no food. His mom was smoking crack. They had money and food stamps and things like that, but he didn't have anything to eat, right? And, he was surrounded in a sort of gang-like area. His friends were in like gangs or selling drugs, and so he was pressured to be in those circumstances, the kinds of things you see in TV shows and movies, kids who grow up in impoverished areas and, tenement housing and projects and things like this. And he was in the ROTC. He was going to join the military as soon as he turned 18. The problem with that is it was 2001, and the big event happened in 2001. He was 15, so in 2004 was in the height, the beginning of these wars in Iraq and, Afghanistan. So, and he was, athletic and, he was in good shape, so I'm sure he became a regular soldier. It's the kind of kid that the Army would love. A kid who's desperate but also has, is smart and he has some talents, right? And his older sister was a good influence on him. She was probably in her 20s. And she was married, and both her and her husband had jobs, but it was like at McDonald's or something, right? And there's people who are in the projects who work jobs, maybe 2 jobs, a job as a janitor, a job as, some, not a menial labor task that most people would want. And they live in the projects, and they're targets because they have actual money, right? They have a little bit more money than the rest of the people there. And so they have stuff, whatever it might be, TVs and things that, whatever they have that other people don't. So they're targets by other people, right? Then there's usually some sort of thug rule. And I'm talking about this everywhere in the world. You have these cities and there's going to be some criminal activity, thugs that run the area, right? That you have to pay protection money to, and they want to recruit your kids to be drug dealers and all these things. It's what people grow up with, right? When I was in graduate school, I had to do a project, human service project. It was a human service school. It's kind of a school that came out of the like a hippie movement, and it was for adults who had jobs, who wanted to get a college education, but weren't able to go to. They were working full time during the week, so the classes were on the weekends. We had 8-hour weekend classes and things, right? But everyone had jobs and usually was a little bit older. I had dropped out of school a couple of times already, and we had to do these human service projects. And so I had, a bunch of the people were from inner city. Some of them were from New York. A lot of them worked in like prisons as prison guards and things like this. And they made a lot of money, but they're horrible jobs. And this guy was, I had 3 people that were in my group. And this guy lived in New Haven, Connecticut, and this school was in Massachusetts. And we had to meet somewhere. He said, well, why don't you come to my, house? I have a, house or whatever in the city. So I drove down to where he lived, and he had like, a house with no yard and bars on the windows and doors. It was nice on the inside, right? But, it was a place where everybody who lived there had bars on their windows and doors. And when I, lived in India, when I was in India, everyone had bars on their, their doors and their no windows without bars on them, right? Because people would break in. The criminal activity, and we're talking about nicer neighborhoods, nicer areas. And when my family and I went to Sri Lanka to get our visas renewed, I've told this story at length on my Journey series, so I'm just going to say it briefly here, but we were in a visa crisis. We had expiring passports, and we were led into Sri Lanka with passports that had less than 6 months on them. And they were expiring, while we were in Sri Lanka. We were there for a month, and they were going to expire within that month. And it's a whole thing there, and I want to get into it with my ex and a whole thing. But my ex decided to go back to America while this was going on. And she went off her medication, and it was a whole thing. She was on thyroid medication that, was life-threatening. She decided to just go off it. And she was, which had emotional and psychological and physical consequences for all of us. And we were told that you don't leave windows and doors open because people would break in. But we were staying at a hotel. My ex was about to leave, and she was having panic attacks, and it was like hot in the hotel or something was going on, and she needed fresh air, so we left the doors open. But it was on the 2nd floor, and she was up and was panicking, and I wasn't sleeping, and we were up till 4 in the morning. And I went to sleep. Finally, went to sleep, and I woke up and I heard rats next to my bed. And then I'm like, maybe it's a monkey. Then I'm like, oh, it's a monkey. I'm half asleep and I'm hearing this noise. And there was monkeys outside that we had seen close to where we were, by the hotel. Little ones. So I thought that some little monkey came in and was, messing around with, there was a, an end table next to the bed. And then all of a sudden I snapped out of it and woke up, and I knew somebody was stealing my wallet. My wallet was inside the end table. I knew it immediately was happening. And I woke up just, and I just snapped, and and it was dark, and there was a dude there, but I couldn't really see him. And I yelled, "Get out of here, MNFer." And he started to run towards the door. And I got up and chased him, and I kind of hit him, and he went over the balcony. All this is in the dark. You could barely see it, right? But he got my wallet, and it had my driver's license in it. And a year later, I'd be coming back to America with no driver's license, so it had effects on it. But it's because we left the door open, and there's all these criminals, and the guy who ran the hotel was corrupt, and he must have told the guy that we were, somebody saw it. And so, and then my ex left and went back to America. That was the end of our, it was a whole thing, right? But there's people who live in these circumstances where you live around criminal activity, you live in unsafe neighborhoods where you're always at threat to be robbed, and, and you're a target if you're a person who's a contributing member to society who has a job and things like this. And you can't make enough money to get out of these circumstances. So this client of mine came in with his older sister. And she was working a job, but it wasn't a good job. But she was, her and her husband were making money, and they weren't on crack like their mom. Their mom was a crackhead. And they wanted me to confront their mom. They wanted to confront their mom in front of me. This older, this girl who was like 25, and her 15-year-old brother. So they brought the mom in, and she, was probably 5'5" or 6" or something, and weighed, I would say, less than 100 pounds. She was on crack, and she was, probably going to die within the next 5 or 10 years. And she, didn't have all of her teeth. And, what are you going to say, right? I mean, like, there's things that they wanted to say to her. Like, there was kind of an intervention, but she wasn't going to get off crack, right? Her life was already done. And this kid was going to go to the military, and he was going to go to Iraq or Afghanistan. And I hope he survived, because he tried to improve himself, right? He was the best client I had. And once in a while I think about him, and I wonder what happened to him, right? Because, he was somebody that deserved better, right? He was working his way out of impossible circumstances. And so what I'm saying here about abortion is that there are people like this all over the world who are going to be born into impossible circumstances. They're going to be impoverished their whole lives. And the people who are pro-life people are usually pro-military, right? And if you're pro-military, you're not pro-life. But also, pro-life people, in general, are pro-death penalty or pro-punishment. And you're bringing these kids into life where they're going to have a criminal or at least impoverished existence. And the moms who are having these kids, their lives are basically, once they have the kid, they're not going to be able to keep their head above water financially. The majority of abortions are single moms who, if they have the baby, they're going to be in poverty for the rest of their lives, and the kid is going to grow up in poverty. And I'm not saying they should have an abortion, but I'm just saying it's not my decision to make, right? And I'm not talking about choice or pro-choice or any of these things, right? I can't make that decision for them. I'm not going to support that kid. It's the same people who are pro-life who don't want to pay money into the system to support people who are impoverished. They don't want people on welfare. They don't want people on food stamps. They don't want to pay extra money in taxes. They don't want to support these kids. They want to make the people have the kids, but don't want to support them, right? And I don't want to support them. Like, I can't take that burden on. And we're not talking about, like, one kid. We're talking about, millions of kids every year. We're talking about over 800,000 kids a year or something like that, right? And just every year. So I believe abortion is murder because life begins at conception, right? But these babies who are born are sentenced, most of them, right? Once in a while you have like a Paris Hilton or someone like that, somebody wealthy who doesn't, want to have a responsibility of a kid or whatever. But that's, very rare. And again, the kid's going to be unloved. It might not grow up not in poverty, but it's going to be unloved, right? It's not going to be, there's no love for that kid. When someone is, doesn't have any love to give, right? And there's plenty of people like that, plenty of women like that. And so my point is, yeah, that abortion's murder, but, everything else about our society, you have all these people living in basically open-air prisons in these areas, whether it be in huts in India or in tenement housing or whatever it might be. There are people who live lives with no chance. They're just doomed. And they contribute nothing to society, right? They're just miserable. The moaning masses, as Babji used to call them, the second master of the Sajmark system. People are just miserable from the time they wake up, and they have no chance, no opportunity. They're not living natural human lives. They're not living as Aboriginal people. They're living in cities and, huts and small areas and, the places where they're confined in those areas, where there's some sort of police or military force to make sure those people are stuck in those areas, right? The people aren't able to leave those areas and go to the places where you live and be around, people who are on the upper echelon of the economic system, the global economic system. And you can't help them, right? And I know this because there are plenty of people who take these kids into their foster homes, and those people's homes are wrecked. And I know of this because, I saw it all the time. A lot of the kids that were in my treatment centers were in foster care. And the foster parents were, there's like Christian families who felt like they had so much love to give. So they take in an impoverished kid, and the impoverished kid acts out and, affects the other kids in the family. Next thing you know, social services involves in that Christian family, and they're taking the kids away from the Christian parents or whatever. I mean, it's things that happen all the time. You know, I was there and I saw it. And these kids would come in, and there are kids who have been abused, and they're already wrecked. They're 3, 4, or 5 years old, and they're already wrecked psychologically, and they can't function, right? People adopt kids like this, and their whole lives become wrecked, right? It's too much of a challenge. There was a young couple who used to milk my family's cows. My family would milk, we had to milk our cows every day. And so when we went and traveled somewhere, which was very rare, but when we did, we needed someone to milk the cows, and there was a young couple that used to do this. And this couple had both graduated from Virginia Tech, it was in that area of the country. And they, nice couple, and they had built an off-grid. They went in and bought money with the husband's, his uncle, and they bought like 60 acres of land, and this young couple had 15 acres of land, and they were, the kid was, he was skilled, and he built a tiny house. And they had a spring, a nice spring on the property where they got their water from. And they were living off grid, and they had this really big garden, and they were cool people, right? Interesting people. And, I'm not in touch with them now, but I'm still friends with a woman on Facebook. The guy didn't have a Facebook account. And there are people that I have respect for, and they're skilled people. They were, neat people. But there was a time on Facebook where I saw that the woman posted that she got the bloop. They're kind of liberal. And, that bummed me out because they have a little girls like 5 or whatever. And they're all getting the bloop. And so later on, she posted something where, and again, like I don't see these things. I don't go on Facebook that much. So once in a while I'd go on Facebook and, very seldomly, like maybe 3 times a month. And not, in depth. But she posted something about getting foster kids. And I'm like, oh, because the guy got into counseling. He ended up doing the job that I did, right? And I was like, well, you probably don't want to do that because it sucks, but, whatever. He was into it. And they went and adopted foster kids. And then, like, 2 months later, there was a post where she said something like, the kids were gone. Like, they had to get rid of the kids. It was just a drain on every level, like just how hard it was on them, right? And these are young people with, energy, and they had some money and whatever it is. They had moved off their property, and they had got more conventional jobs. They ended up selling their off-the-grid place, and they were living now more conventional lives, right, or whatever. But they couldn't take these foster kids in because these kids are wrecked, right? There's kids like this all over the place, and well-meaning people who want to help. You can't help them. And I saw it with these kids at treatment centers. I mean, I've talked about this, in depth in other places. But what I'm saying is there's lots of people that there's no place for. There's no pathway forward to having just a reasonably, I don't know if the word natural, because certainly we don't live natural lives, but, live a life where you have, you can think about all the people who just suck, who have money. Think about all the people that who are, they're rich or they're middle class, and they live dysfunctional lives. They have crappy marriages, crappy relationships with their kids. Kids are addicted to the internet. Kids are not living anything like a normal life. Their jobs are kind of unnatural. Those people, like, all of us to some extent, we're all living unnatural lives. Like, we don't live natural human lives, and most people are miserable, depressed, on psychological medications, self-medicating. Think about, how many people you think are living good lives and are cognizant. And think about all the sheeple out there, then all the goofy cubies and all the horrible people in the truth community. Like, how many people you're like, wow, like that person is someone I could look up to. How many people that are an inspiration and you would like to achieve what they achieved? How many people are like that, right? So think about that. That's what human life is right now. So, yeah, abortion sucks. All of it does. But it's just a part of a bigger suck, right? And so pro-life people are, these one-issue people. They want to take a symptom. Abortion is a symptom of the evil of our society, the beast. Abortion is just a symptom. And you can address the symptom, but the problem's going to go elsewhere. And you don't want to deal with the problem, right? You don't want to, you don't have anything else to offer other than, getting rid of this law, and don't want anything more to do with it, right? Like, that's all right. Let's get rid of Roe v. Wade, and state by state people make a decision, and they can't get abortion, sure. But are you going to deal with that unwanted kid? Are you going to help with that unwanted kid? What are you going to do? You're going to contribute money, and some are you going to pay more taxes? What are you going to do? No, like, that's, I just want to get rid of the law. Well, it's a symptom. The symptom's going to come elsewhere, right? What about when that kid grows up and breaks into your house, or ours your daughter, or kills somebody, or kills your neighbor, and you want that kid to go to the death penalty, or you want that kid to, have the death penalty? What? Like, what would it be then, right? So it's the hypocrisy of the thing. It's not looking at the whole societal problem, and not dealing with your own miserable existence and your own, dysfunctional life, your dysfunctional marriage, your dysfunctional kids, and your abusive religion, and all these things. Your worship of Donald Trump, who's a piece of crap, right? Who paid for his share of abortions, I'm sure, himself, right? So, I mean, it's just the hypocrisy of the thing, right? It's just like these one-issue people who want other people to change and want to affect other people's decisions and other people's lives, but don't want to do anything really to help them. And then acknowledging that you can't help them. That's the bigger thing. Then realizing you can't help these people. You can't help, like, your own family members. You can't help your loser brother, or your crazy mom, or, the people in your life. You can't get them to change. You can't get them to, you can't do anything to help them. You don't have enough energy. You don't have, even if you did, they won't respond. They won't listen. They won't, they won't change, right? I mean, it's the helplessness of the thing. We really can't help all these people. We can't help the dregs of society, but we can't help the rich people either, right? The people who are the most money, they're the craziest, these hoarders of wealth, and you find out the lifestyles they have, and yeah, they don't worry financially, but I guess they worry that the system's going to collapse, or they'll be they'll lose everything that they have. Of course, that's their worry, but in terms of right now, they have money to do anything, and the stuff that they engage in is horrific, right? But there's a futility when you have an unnatural, beastly system that's not based in divine principles and the natural order of things, and it's a scam system. It's an economy based in illusion, and a debt-based economy, and all the things that go with it, and materialism and things, and hedonism that are far away from what your soul wants you to be a part of here on this planet, right? Your soul has a spiritual purpose. You have a spiritual goal, and your life is an obstacle. The system is an obstacle and a distraction, and it creates an ego that hijacks your soul's purpose on this planet, and that's where we're all at, right? And very few people solve this equation, or even are moving in a positive direction to minimize their ego, connect to the divinity within them, and get back on their soul's path. I mean, it's less than 1%. It's a fraction of 1% of the people that end up making any kind of strides along those lines, and everyone else is going in the wrong direction. And that's our situation. And so taking political stances and having let's address this issue or that, or protesting, you're missing out on the bigger point, right? That life on planet Earth right now is futile because people have wrecked their social constructs and are living unnatural, ungodly lives. And we have a system that encourages decadence and deviance and immoral behavior, and a disconnect from your family, and from the divinity within you, and from the natural order of things. And that's the only problem that we should be working on, and we can only do it personally. We can't fix it for everybody, but we can do it personally, and that's what I cover here. And even in that, I mean, just doing that a little bit is better than doing nothing, right? Making some inroads to where you're connecting with your soul and the divinity within you, and even in this dysfunctional world, and this this cesspit that we live in, we can bring divinity within our circumstances and connect to God, and start making some progress in returning to the source, going back to the the divine source that all of us, our souls, crave to return to, right? And even if we make small progress, just a little bit of headway, it's better than going backwards. Only spirituality will save this world. It's Paramano, definitely pointing for the apocalypse and the ascension. Everyone have a blessed day and be grateful.